All right, so where I left off on Wednesday, we were talking about recessionary and inflationary gaps, and I went ahead and I kind of plotted them using the frameworks that we were familiar with, the aggregate expenditure schedule, which is how we previously presented the inflationary and recessionary gaps, and then the aggregate demand schedule, aggregate demand, aggregate supply schedule, which is, we're introducing aggregate supply now, and I wanted to demonstrate that you could still show an inflationary gap using both different models, right? Because the aggregate expenditure schedule should jive with your aggregate demand from the aggregate demand aggregate supply schedule, right? Essentially, when you plot the aggregate expenditure schedule, in order to wind up with this equilibrium price being the same as the equilibrium price in the, this equilibrium GDP being the same equilibrium GDP in the, looks like I must have moved around the graph a little bit since last time. Let me fix this for a second. But in order to get the same equilibrium GDP back across both graphs, essentially all you have to do is say that this aggregate expenditure schedule applies to a price that is the equilibrium price in the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, okay? So if this equilibrium price is the background price for the aggregate expenditure schedule, then you're going to get back the same equilibrium GDP, because this equilibrium GDP, equilibrium price, and it's not shown on here because aggregate expenditure does not have price built into it, but this equilibrium GDP, equilibrium price, has to be one-to-one with a point on the demand schedule, right? So if this is the equilibrium GDP that's the same as this one, then it must be the case that the equilibrium price is this equilibrium price, right? Okay, because remember, aggregate expenditure schedule does not tell you what the price is. You can't see it on the, it's like not on this graph. So if the price changes, you're shifting the graph. If the price goes down, your graph goes up. If the price goes up, graph goes down, okay? But if the price goes up in aggregate demand, well, you're moving along the demand curve because price is the y-axis variable on the aggregate demand, aggregate supply curve, okay? So what would cause a movement of this graph is just a movement along this graph, along the aggregate demand curve. So that's how you get back to plotting the same inflationary or recessionary gap from an aggregate expenditure schedule that you can plot on an aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph here. Okay, so technically speaking, we can have the same recessionary gap. I ran into this problem the other day. We can have the same recessionary gap regardless of whether you're, nope, I'm going to stop trying to move this purple line because it has been a pain in the butt. You can have the same recessionary gap whether you're looking at either graph, okay? Of course, nothing specifies that this has to be the aggregate expenditure for the price level of equilibrium, okay, the equilibrium price level. It could be any aggregate expenditure schedule, so don't assume that just because you found an intersection on the aggregate expenditure schedule, it's going to be equilibrium GDP in the long run. It's only equilibrium GDP on the demand side. Okay, that's the demand side equilibrium that we built up to in the first few lectures. Okay, now we need to consider aggregate supply. Okay, all right. So the expenditure schedule determines equilibrium GDP for a given price level, right? That's the important part, for a given price level, right? It does not assume that you are at equilibrium price. What the expenditure schedule can do is tell you if national income equals output, okay? If essentially you're earning the same thing that you're producing, okay, the same dollar value. And that's, as I said before, almost a philosophical truism, so to speak. It's something that must be true. okay? And I'm not going to explain it again, but essentially, if I give you $5 for payment, okay, that's your income, but that's also $5 that I've just spent on consumption or investment or whatever, okay? So that's why the aggregate expenditure has to equal national income, has to equal output, has to equal equilibrium GDP. They're all the same once you reach demand side equilibrium, okay? But then you need to build in supply side equilibrium, which then gives you a particular price, okay? So the aggregate demand, aggregate supply, that's what this stands for. Aggregate demand, aggregate supply framework determines what the ultimate price level is, okay? Right. So again, you can have the same recessionary gap mapped onto the two different frameworks. In this case, the aggregate expenditure framework, and then in this case, the aggregate demand, aggregate supply framework, okay? On the y-axis of aggregate expenditure is expenditure. On the x-axis is real GDP, okay? And assuming you've gotten to the right price level, then this E should equal this E. This equilibrium GDP should equal this equilibrium GDP, okay? If you take this to the y-axis, you're not going to get the equilibrium price level because price doesn't appear on the aggregate expenditure graph. Okay, this is real expenditure in the y-axis here. But if you take it over here, you will get the equilibrium price level. Okay, real GDP is the x-axis, good for both. Okay, the line here is your aggregate expenditure line, C plus I plus G plus X minus IM. Consumptions, investments, government expenditure, exports, imports, okay? Potential GDP is still a straight line because it is the GDP that corresponds to full employment, which is essentially just one projected GDP for that year. Doesn't depend on the price level, doesn't depend on the expenditure level, okay? The 45-degree line is the condition that national income has to equal aggregate expenditure, right? All right. Then on the aggregate demand, aggregate supply framework, you have price level on the y-axis. You have demand having a negative relationship with the price level. So the higher the price, the lower the quantity demanded. Okay. And vice versa with supply. The higher the price, the higher the supply. Why do those two things hold? And this is all just kind of recapping what we've talked about in the last, particularly the last lecture, but especially, but also the last like 3 or 4 lectures, right? So why does demand have a negative relationship with price? You can see that coming from here, okay? So the equilibrium GDP that you get on the demand side is not price specific. Come on. Is not price specific. So as you raise the price, the entire aggregate expenditure model, aggregate expenditure function is going to shift downwards, leading to a lower equilibrium GDP. Okay, so that could correspond to a point like here. Okay, lower equilibrium GDP, higher price. Okay, if you decrease the price, okay, remember consumption will increase because people feel more wealthy. Investments in government expenditure might also increase. You don't know that. Exports is probably going to increase. Imports is probably going to decrease, which is good. So definitely this is going to increase. This is definitely going to increase. This will probably increase. This is more dependent on what the government chooses to do. But that'll raise your aggregate expenditure schedule because this is higher. This is higher. This is probably higher. Okay. Raise your aggregate expenditure schedule. I do want to say that consumption is the biggest part. So when you raise the prices, or when you lower prices, consumption is going to be the most reactive. But anyway, if you lower the prices, you're raising the aggregate expenditure schedule, okay, leading to a higher potential, higher equilibrium GDP on the demand side, which could be a point like here. Okay. On the other hand, for supply, so that's why you have a negative relationship with demand. On the other hand, for supply is essentially your per unit, it's driven by your per unit profit. So you have price minus your input cost divided by essentially the productivity, which can be like technological growth or whatever. So if price goes up and your input costs and technology are the same, which they generally will be in a short run, okay, then as price goes up, your quantity supplied should increase because you're going to have more per unit profit, meaning more firms can afford to be in the market, okay, and those firms that are already in the market can afford to produce more. Okay, so that's just a brief overview of the two different graphs, comparing and contrasting, and going over where we got up to this point. Okay, so anyway, here we have plotted the same the same recessionary gap across both models. Okay, it's recessionary because potential GDP is higher than your equilibrium GDP. Okay, right. So that means that you're essentially producing lower than your output. You're producing lower than what your output could be in the case of full employment, meaning you're in a recession, or you're about to be in a recession. Okay. So you can see that here, the potential GDP is at 7,000, equilibrium GDP is at 6,000. All right. Pretty easy once you are solid enough in the concepts of the graph. Okay. I did talk about why potential GDP is aligned, so I'm not going to repeat that. Okay. So now this is the case where potential GDP is exactly at equilibrium GDP. Okay, and then if we drag the line to the left, we're going to have an inflationary gap. Okay, so this is the case where potential GDP is lower than equilibrium GDP. All right. So you would expect perhaps that given that's the case, so maybe in the short run supply is looking the way that it does, but if the prices are high enough, right, that's going to, if you're in an inflationary gap, essentially you've tightened the workforce, meaning that in order to attract new workers, which you want to do because you're producing so much, so in order to attract new workers so you can help chug along production, you're going to have to pay them more because there's less workers available. So if you pay them more, what happens to your input cost? Input costs are going to rise. Okay, as input costs rise, that's going to lead to a shift of supply. So supply is going to shift in. Okay, so eventually, maybe it doesn't hit potential GDP. Maybe potential GDP shifts out later, like by the time that supply is fully reacted. But you would expect supply to shift in, essentially to meet where it is at potential GDP. When it does that, let's say your supply fully meets potential GDP here, okay, where potential GDP is right now, okay, you're going to be at this equilibrium point, which is a GDP of 7,000 and a price level that is higher than your old price level. Okay, so your prices have increased by virtue of going further up on the graph, okay, because price is on the y-axis. Okay, so your prices have increased. That means you have inflation. Right. Okay, so just revisiting the actual and potential GDP graph from when we first introduced the concept of potential GDP, you can see then these recessions are essentially periods of time where you have recessionary gaps. The few that you can see here are inflationary gaps. So the late 90s into probably 2001 about. That's the only one that I really see. I guess this is potential GDP. So we had a recessionary gap. An inflationary gap. Okay, this is right before this makes sense. This is right before the global recession, essentially what happened was we cut taxes. So we did some expansionary fiscal policy, which we'll get into. And then the Feds kept rates low because they weren't anticipating a recession, which in both cases I think was essentially poor planning. But easy for me to say in hindsight. If I were in the Fed, it probably would be much worse than they were. So, the 60s boom has an inflationary gap. Many more recessionary gaps than inflationary gaps. We're generally pretty good at keeping inflation in line because we have so many monetary options for that, and usually inflation doesn't just hit. And on top of that, we're what's called the reserve currency of the world, so we have a little bit of more wiggle room for inflation than some other countries do. All right. Okay, so actually let's stop here and then we'll talk about policies, procedures for closing recessionary and inflationary gaps.